You are sitting in a waiting room. Fluorescent lights hum above you. A clipboard rests on your knee. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you know you are about to describe something that has no easy words. Something that lives inside you but cannot be seen. Something your ancestors had a name for too, just not the name you would expect. Mental illness is not a modern invention. Your brain is not uniquely broken. The suffering that keeps you up at night, the thoughts that spiral without permission, the disconnection from the world around you, none of that is new. What is new is the explanation. And for most of human history, that explanation was nothing like what you have been told.
5,000 years ago, if your mind began to fracture, someone would not hand you a prescription. They would hand you a ritual. They would call a priest. They would open a vein, burn an herb, carve a symbol into the wall beside your bed. Because what was happening to you was not a disease. It was a message. This is the story of how ancient civilizations explained mental illness, and what they got wrong, and what, against all reason, they may have gotten right. Start in Mesopotamia. Start where civilization itself started. The Sumerians and Babylonians lived in what is now Iraq, roughly 4,000 years ago. They built cities, invented writing, developed astronomy. They were, by any measure, sophisticated, and their explanation for mental illness was this: demons.
Specifically, the demon Asaku and the ghost Atimu. These were not metaphors. The Babylonians meant this literally. If your behavior became erratic, if you heard voices, if you stopped eating, if you became convinced that something unseen was pursuing you, a demon had entered your body. It had slipped inside you through a moment of spiritual carelessness, a broken vow, a neglected ritual, an ancestor left unburied. The treatment was exorcism. A physician called the Ashipu would recite incantations from clay tablets. They would burn cedar and juniper. They would press amulets against the sick person's skin. The ritual could last for days. Here is the strange part. It sometimes worked. Not because demons are real, but because what the Ashipu was actually doing, the repetition, the ritual, the presence of a healer, the community gathered around the suffering person, activated something real in the human nervous system. Psychologists today call it the placebo response, the therapeutic alliance, the healing power of being witnessed. The Babylonians had no framework for any of that, but they built a system around it anyway. Move west. Move to ancient Egypt. Around 1550 BCE, the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in human history, contains a section on the heart, not the physical heart, the spiritual heart. The ancient Egyptians believed that the heart was the seat of the mind. When your thoughts became disordered, your heart had been disturbed by grief, by a wandering uterus, by the gods themselves.
This is where it gets interesting. Egyptian physicians were among the first to suggest that the environment could cause mental disturbance. They recommended that patients with disturbed minds be taken to temples, not purely for prayer, but for rest, for music, for walks along the Nile, for painting and storytelling. Historian John F. Nunn, in his analysis of ancient Egyptian medicine, noted that these practices bore a striking resemblance to what modern psychiatry calls milieu therapy, healing through environment, through calm, through beauty. The Egyptians did not know what a neurotransmitter was, but they understood that a suffering mind needed more than ritual. It needed softness. Now cross into ancient Greece, and here the story fractures into two. The first voice is the one you already know, Hippocrates. Around 400 BCE, he looked at patients others were blaming on gods and said, "No, this is the brain." He wrote that epilepsy, then called the sacred disease because people believed seizures were divine possession, was not sacred at all. It was a disorder of the brain. He identified melancholia, what we would now call depression, as an excess of black bile, one of his 4 bodily humors. He was wrong about the mechanism, but he was right about the direction. Mental illness was biological. It lived in the body. It could be studied. But the second Greek voice is less famous and just as important. Plato argued that madness was not always a curse. In the Phaedrus, he wrote that the greatest gifts came through mania, through divine madness, the madness of prophecy, the madness of love, The madness of artistic creation. Researcher Edward Shorter, in his History of Psychiatry, points out that this idea that certain forms of altered thinking are not pathology but vision quietly shaped Western thought for centuries. The tension Plato set in motion still exists. You feel it every time someone describes a creative genius as a little mad. Every time someone wonders whether treating a condition might cost them something essential about who they are. Move further east. Move to ancient India around 600 BCE. The Ayurvedic texts, particularly the Charaka Samhita, described mental illness in terms of imbalanced doshas, energetic forces within the body. But they went further than any culture before them. The Charaka Samhita outlined dozens of distinct mental conditions. It described what sounds like schizophrenia, what sounds like obsessive-compulsive disorder, what sounds like depression following trauma. It recommended herbal treatments, dietary changes, and, remarkably, conversation, talking to the patient, understanding what happened to them before the breakdown began. Psychiatrist P.H. Kutumbia, in his analysis of ancient Indian medicine, wrote that the Charaka Samhita's approach to mental illness was, in key respects, more person-centered than the biomedical models that dominated Western psychiatry in the 20th century. The ancient Indian physician asked, "What is happening in this person's life?" The modern psychiatrist, for much of recent history, asked, "What is happening in this person's chemistry?"
Both questions matter, and it took thousands of years to understand that. Then comes Rome, and Rome, for the most part, took the Greek model and made it cruder. Roman physicians used purging, bleeding, cold baths, and physical restraint for the mentally ill. There were exceptions. The physician Cyrannus of Ephesus argued for gentle treatment, human dignity, engagement with patients, but he was arguing against the tide. And then came the Middle Ages in Europe, and here the story goes dark. With the rise of the church as the primary institutional power, the Babylonian model returned in Christian clothing. Mental illness was possession. It was sinfulness made visible. The treatment was prayer, penance, and exorcism. Those who could not be cured were feared. Some were chained. Some were burned. But even here, the story is not simple. Historian Andrew Scull, in his extensive work on the history of madness, notes that most mentally ill people in medieval Europe were not institutionalized at all. They were cared for at home, by family, by the community that knew them. The monastery offered shelter. The village absorbed them. The cruelty was real, but so was the integration.
Institutionalization, the locking away of the mentally ill in asylums, came later. It came with the Enlightenment. It came with the industrial city, where wandering and strangeness became threatening and inconvenient rather than mysterious and sacred. The first asylum was not built in ancient Babylon. It was built in the modern world by people who believed they were being rational. And now here you are, sitting in that waiting room with the fluorescent lights. A system has built itself around you, a system of diagnoses and medications, of insurance codes and clinical language, of evidence-based treatments that are genuinely saving lives. The system is more sophisticated than anything the ancient world could offer. But researchers are circling back to old questions. The field of cultural psychiatry, scholars like Arthur Kleinman at Harvard, has spent decades showing that how a society understands mental illness shapes how its members experience it and recover from it. The story a culture tells about suffering changes the suffering itself.
The Babylonian who believed a demon had entered them also believed that the demon could leave, that healing was possible, that the whole community had a role to play. The Egyptian who lay beside the Nile and listened to music had been given permission to rest, to receive, to be tended to. Modern psychiatry has powerful tools, but it sometimes struggles to give people those older things, the meaning, the ritual, the sense that what is happening to them is not simply a malfunction, but a signal worth listening to. You are sitting in that waiting room. You have inherited 4,000 years of answers to the question of what is wrong with you. The demon theory, the bile theory, the divine madness theory, the dosha theory, the chemical imbalance theory. Each one a civilization reaching into the darkness and trying to bring something back.
None of them had the whole picture. None of them do. The darkness is still large. But here you are, still reaching.